This is the beginning of part 2 of our module on airline industry analysis, which examines the approach of the credit rating agencies to assessing the credit risk of global passenger airlines, reviews the principal publications by the agencies on the subjects, illustrates the more critical calculations they require, and applies their guidelines to the assessment of one particular airline to drive home in the clearest manner the key learning points. We remind you that Part 2 contains 2 chapters. Chapter 3, which describes S&P's approach to airline ratings, compares it to Moody's, and comments on the pros and cons of each. And Chapter 4, which applies the Moody's scoring approach to a medium-sized international carrier to derive its estimated credit rating. This Chapter 3 describes S&P's approach to airline ratings, compares it to Moody's, and comments on the pros and cons of each. Unlike Moody's, S&P avoids the heavy use of quantitative risk factors and provides instead a general description of industry characteristics and risk considerations. S&P begins by ranking risk factors in 3 categories as follows. Category 1, factors are those that ordinarily affect the rating outcome in a meaningful way and in many instances are critical to S&P's rating conclusion. Category 2 factors are of lesser importance, but they may in some instances prove critical. And Category 3 factors may be individually meaningful in a few instances, but ordinarily just shape the company's overall profile in conjunction with the other factors. Category 1 factors for an airline include the following. Market position, including the following key elements. Route network, the revenue potential of the markets the airline serves, and the strength of the airline's competitive position in those markets, which may be enhanced by implicit government support in some countries. Revenue generation, which includes capacity utilization and pricing. And finally, operating cost structure relative to competition and the company's revenue model. Category 2 factors include diversity of revenues based on geography, types of passengers, and contribution of non-passenger services. Category 3 factors, finally, include the age, technology, and suitability of aircraft fleet to the airline's operating requirements, labor relations, and service standards and reputation. S&P then proceeds to examine in succession the airline's business risk and financial risk, breaking each down into a series of subtopics illustrated in the charts about to appear. Business risk is subdivided into 4 categories. Country and macroeconomic risk, industry risk, competitive position including management, and profitability/peer comparison. S&P evaluates each category and determines one of 6 scores for overall business risk: excellent, strong, satisfactory, fair, weak, or vulnerable. Regarding country risk, S&P observes that all private sector credit ratings are affected significantly by the jurisdiction in which they are located, via the effect of government policies, safety and environmental regulation, the air traffic control system, airport infrastructure, and labor law. S&P also notes a paradox in that large developed countries such as the US are wealthy enough to support substantial travel demand, but tend to have a fragmented airline industry with intense competition, while less developed countries such as Brazil have more volatile economies but also offer stronger growth prospects for travel demand. The industry risk section in the S&P report is perhaps the most instructive. The rating agency focuses on a comparison of the airline industry's risk profile with that of other industries, emphasizing that while risk categories are broadly similar across industries, the effect of these factors on credit risk can vary markedly among industries. The tables we are about to show are reproduced from the S&P 1 document and provide a comprehensive summary of the airline industry risk characteristics in comparison to those of the aerospace, auto, and freight/railroad industries. The first of these tables breaks down industry dynamics and competitive environment into 9 sub-characteristics listed in the first column. There is no need to comment in detail on each one of these, but note in particular S&P's view that demographic trends, product substitution, and product obsolescence are favorable factors for airlines, while industry cyclicality, pricing inflexibility, and commoditization are unfavorable. Comparison to the other 3 industries yields interesting insights as well. S&P regards ease of entry to be similar for airlines as for the auto industry. It also deems railroads to have greater pricing power than airlines and to offer a less commoditized service. Regrettably, the rating agency does not attempt to justify each of these judgments, so we are left a little in the dark as to their basis. These observations are summarized for your convenience on the slide appearing now. This next table breaks down growth and profitability into 3 sub-characteristics listed in the first column. Not surprisingly, profit margin pressure and earnings volatility score poorly for the airline sector, but the medium ranking for the overall growth outlook for airlines may seem strange given the favorable demographic trends acknowledged in the preceding table. We break down the third part of the table, addressing operating considerations and costs, into 2 subparts due to space considerations. You will note in this first subpart the high ranking for cost rigidity, operating leverage, energy cost sensitivity, labor costs, and labor inflexibility, many of which we have commented upon already in Chapter 1. You will also note the low or low to medium exposure to technological risk, research and development costs, and raw material cost sensitivity. This may seem partly surprising again, for while airlines may not directly engage in much R&D, nor purchase many raw materials, other than energy, which was handled separately as we saw, they are indirectly exposed to those factors, since the purchase price for aircraft reflects the manufacturer's R&D and raw material costs. These are inevitably passed through to the airlines, perhaps after a lag of some time. Indeed, airlines are often advised by derivative sales departments with proposals to hedge the aluminum price risk of their future aircraft purchases, an acknowledgement of this indirect exposure that can be extremely substantial for those with large scheduled aircraft deliveries. Note finally the medium to high rankings for pension and environmental costs, two factors whose importance is only likely to increase going forward. This second subpart of the section on operating considerations and costs is interesting in a number of ways. Marketing costs are not perceived by S&P to be particularly burdensome for airlines, presumably because most customers already know which airlines fly from their home base and do not need much information beyond the time of departure and the price of the ticket. Still, this may seem puzzling to someone who sees numerous ads in the various media about new flight destinations and offers for attractive fares. The importance of risk management, asset quality and upkeep, and event risk sensitivity, of course, needs no justification. And for most airlines, customer concentration risk is clearly a non-issue, while the ranking of supplier concentration in the medium category reflects, we believe, the oligopoly of aircraft manufacturers rather than suppliers of fuel, catering, or information technology. This next table addresses capital and financing characteristics, which it breaks down into the three subcategories you see in the first column. High capital intensity and borrowing requirements cause no surprise. The medium level sensitivity to interest rates is more debatable. For while any entity with large borrowing requirements necessarily is more sensitive to rate changes than others, the aggregate impact of a substantial increase in interest rates, even assuming a high percentage of floating rate debt, is likely in the case of most airlines to come a distant second to the exposure to jet fuel prices and currencies. Airlines also often argue that since high rates are frequently accompanied by a vibrant economy, they have a natural hedge against rate increases. Although this argument is more difficult to support in the case of airlines located in one jurisdiction but exposed to interest rate increases in a foreign currency due to the denomination of their debt in that currency. Conversely, it is unclear why the industry's sensitivity to interest rates should be considered lower than that of auto manufacturers, an equally capital-intensive and highly leveraged sector. This final part of the table, addressing government, regulatory, and legal environment, is broken down into the three subcategories you see in the first column. High regulatory risk has been mentioned before, and the risk of litigation is obvious in any industry where terrorism attacks and accidents can result in enormous liabilities. We already commented in Chapter 1 on how both rating agencies view negatively the airline sector's high fuel and labor cost exposure and high operating leverage, and also how these are mitigated by the absence of obvious substitutes for many routes, the favorable economic and demographic trends, and the ease of obtaining financing against unencumbered assets. S&P is eager to emphasize, in regard to a high industry risk profile, that it does not automatically limit its rating on a company, especially for those individual issuers that are able to differentiate themselves via some competitive advantage or stronger business risk profile, including solid global or regional diversification, possible operating cost advantages, and prudent leverage and financial policies. So the rating agency turns next to a description of its company-specific analysis. S&P lists market position, diversification, operating efficiency, and management as the four key factors that determine an airline's competitive position. We address each of these next. Market position focuses on the following risk factors ranked from most to least important. Market position in Category 1, route network in Category 1, attractiveness of revenue potential of markets served, still in Category 1, strength of position within those markets, including potential support from governments in some countries or for selected airlines, still in Category 1. And finally, service standards and reputation in Category 3. A long discussion follows at this point regarding the identification and assessment of these factors. But in summary, S&P focuses especially on the airline's route network and its access to major markets that generate business travel and with good growth potential and some barriers to entry. Also on the extent of its alliances and its use of hubs, and on the degree of likely government support, whether direct or via restrictions on competition. The rating agency also examines the convenience of the airline schedule and the popularity of its frequent flyer program. S&P defines diversification more broadly than Moody's, emphasizing that it includes geographic distribution of flights, mix of types of passengers between business and leisure, and revenue and income contribution from non-passenger services. For example, S&P claims that British Airways suffered more than competitors such as Lufthansa and Air France following the 2008 financial meltdown due to its heavy reliance on the UK to US business and first class passenger service. Revenues from non-passenger services include cargo shipments, despite its high volatility as perceived by S&P, maintenance work for other airlines, and finally the sale of frequent flyer miles to partner companies such as credit cards, hotel chains, car rental companies, and others. Operating efficiency makes up another major part of S&P's analysis of airline competitive position, and it is defined to include operating cost structure relative to competition in Category 1, revenue generation, also in Category 1, age, technology, and suitability of aircraft fleet to the airline's operating requirements in Category 3, and labor relations, also in Category 3. S&P specifies operating expense after depreciation per available seat kilometer as a standard measure of operating cost, pointing out that this measure is influenced by the mix of coach and business or first class seating and by the level of fuel prices. Revenue generation depends mostly on capacity utilization, i.e. the average load factor for the flights completed, and pricing, typically analyzed in terms of yield, defined to be the ratio of passenger revenues to revenue passenger kilometers. In other words, if an airline generates passenger revenues of $150 million while flying 1 million paying passengers, an average of 1,000 kilometers each, its yield is 150 million over 1 million times 1,000, i.e. 15%, a fairly typical yield figure for many airlines. The rating agency often multiplies the yield by the load factor to derive passenger revenue per available seat kilometer, which it regards as a more complete measure of revenue generation than either of its component parts. Lower down the list comes the fleet age and fuel efficiency, the variety of aircraft flown, and their suitability to the airline's route structure. Aging fleets impose penalties in operating performance and often presage heavy future capital expenditures. Conversely, fleets with relatively few models and engine types simplify training and maintenance, reducing costs. S&P completes this section of its analysis by examining profitability and peer comparisons, using the following three ratios: pre-tax, pre-interest return on capital, operating income plus depreciation and amortization as a percentage of sales, and finally, operating income after depreciation and amortization as a percentage of sales. These various profitability measures are adjusted in a manner similar to Moody's, but not identical to it, for off-balance sheet leases and pension and other post-retirement liabilities, each of which can be quite material for some airlines. S&P comments that return on capital tends to be low for airlines, often in the single digits when depreciation is included, reflecting the capital intensity of the business. Indeed, the rating agency views capital intensity as a limiting ratings factor for airlines. Operating margins are measured before and after depreciation, given how substantial depreciation expense can be for airlines. The second major part of S&P's analysis focuses on financial risk, broken down into accounting characteristics, financial governance and risk tolerance, cash flow adequacy, capital structure and leverage, and liquidity/short-term factors. These generate a score for overall financial risk, ranging from minimal to modest, intermediate, significant, aggressive, and finally, highly leveraged. Regarding accounting adjustments, we have noted already that leasing and pension deficits are particularly significant for many airlines and are treated as debt-like liabilities by S&P. The rating agency observes that for many airlines, the present value of off-balance sheet leases is greater than balance sheet debt, and also that pension deficits can be substantial, despite the common cutbacks on benefits implemented in recent years. The assessment of financial governance and risk tolerance includes a review of management's views and practices on dividends, share repurchases, funding of acquisitions and capital expenditures, as well as target capital structure and the steps taken to achieve it. Buybacks and dividends in particular are viewed as presenting significant risk given the industry's high fixed capital requirement. Enterprise risk management practices, including hedging policies and positions, are especially important in view of the key influence of energy costs on profitability and cash flows, but raise liquidity risks given the need to post collateral in increasing amounts when these generate credit exposure for the counterparty against the airline. The effectiveness of a hedging program depends on the proportion of fuel needs hedged, the price at which the hedges become effective, the type of hedging instruments used, and the credit quality of the counterparties. Currency hedging can also be important for airlines in developing countries, whose revenues are often in local currencies, but whose fuel and aircraft costs are in US dollars. In apparent contradiction to its earlier characterization as representing medium risk, interest rate risk is described in this section of the report as less of a risk than for some other capital-intensive industries, because much airline debt takes the form of long-term, fixed-rate, aircraft-backed obligations. Cash flow adequacy is evaluated via two ratios: EBITDA interest coverage and funds flow to debt. In this regard, S&P comments that because of the large proportion of fixed assets on an airline's balance sheet, non-cash depreciation expense generally is significant, causing cash flow generation to be materially better than reported earnings. The prepayment for most tickets, on which we have commented before, generally means that a growing airline does not need to invest in working capital and is fairly cash-rich at times. Conversely, airlines do need to make significant capital expenditures to acquire aircraft and substantial debt and leases to finance them, a burden mitigated a little by the long lives of those assets and the related debt and leases. S&P also observes that the ability to extend the useful life of aircraft enables airlines to defer most capital expenditures for several years to manage through a downturn. Indicators of leverage include debt to capital, meaning debt divided by debt plus equity, debt to EBITDA, and debt to revenues. S&P notes that these ratios are high relative to those of most industrial companies, but that much of the differential results from past losses that have eroded book equity and from the practice of not recognizing on the balance sheet a number of material assets, such as international route rights and takeoff and landing slots at crowded airports. Furthermore, when measuring debt to EBITDA, S&P also sometimes compares it to debt to EBITDAR, which adds back to EBITDA the full amount of lease rentals. The final component of S&P's financial risk analysis addresses liquidity and short-term factors. S&P notes that airlines typically have several possible options for maximizing near-term cash flow when they are faced with severe liquidity pressures, including shrinking operations, especially the least profitable routes, selling excess aircraft or other assets, such as international routes or airport facilities, and reducing capital expenditures, which may require deferring scheduled aircraft deliveries. Shrinking operations reduces near-term cash losses, but typically does not result in a reduction in fixed costs proportionate to the reduction in flights. It also causes some aircraft to become surplus to the airline's needs when its sale or sublease in the midst of a downturn is likely to generate suboptimal proceeds. The sale of international route rights, finally, sacrifices future growth opportunities for short-term liquidity. The principal source of backup liquidity for many airlines is their fairly large level of unrestricted cash, supplanting or even replacing entirely bank facilities. For U.S. airlines, the level of unrestricted cash as a percentage of revenues often ranges from 10 to 30%, with cash holdings typically well in excess of current debt maturities. S&P cautions, however, that a significant portion of an airline's cash may become restricted if the airline is in financial distress and the bank that processes its credit card sales begins holding back a portion of proceeds as security against the airline's possible default. S&P completes its analysis of financial risk with an examination of external funding sources. The rating agency notes that bank lending to airlines shrank during the 2008 financial meltdown, and also that bank facilities are often subject to covenants that make their availability uncertain. This is not as critical as it might be in other industries, given the availability for many U.S. and non-U.S. airlines of secured financing and so-called enhanced equipment trust certificates in the U.S. bond markets, and also of medium-term operating leases in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. This completes this chapter 3.